What we do here is go back.
Hi, and welcome back to Mr. Toyama's AP World History. This is Chapter 23, The Transformation of Europe, Part 2. So next up we have absolute monarchies. This is a very strange thing that we don't all have in our world today, but it's the theory of divine right of kings. So here's how it works. Because Europe was Christian at this time, they believed that God oversaw all things in life. And since God made the king only God can judge him. So since God is the king of the universe and some reason we have a king, the kings are put in place by God. This goes back to a very famous passage in the Bible where they're talking about we should show respect to our rulers and the people that have been ordained by God. And since the God put the king in charge, then only God can judge the king. So we have no right to really fight back against the king. We have no right to really question the king and his authority. And this created within the kings the idea of absolute monarchies or absolute power. Whatever the king said went. This didn't really allow for places for like parliaments or different types of governmental bodies that are appointed by the people or voted in by the people to really have any say in what went on. This idea comes from French absolutism, which is designed by Cardinal Richelieu under King Louis XIII from 1624 to 1642. It's one of those things that the church interacting very closely with the government in Europe that creates the power and balance. We go all the way back to Constantine, where Constantine was arguing that he is both the head of the church and also the head of state. And as a result, many people were questioning, well, where's the line? Where's the separation between church and state? That very famous quotation from one of the letters from Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptists. That's a push thing that you're going to look at a little bit later. But if you think about it, why should we listen to the king? Well, God put him in place. That goes back to this belief that God is in charge of everything. As a result, they destroyed the castles of nobles, crushed aristocratic conspiracies, or aristocrats trying to overthrow the king or get rid of the king in power. They built a bureaucracy to bolster the royal power base. The king can't really do it all, but the king can appoint people to do it all. And as a result, he creates a bureaucracy, which one of my favorite B words in all of world history. And this is in part as a design to give the king the sense of absolute power. Because the king lives far away and he lives in his castle and he's nice and safe, what you need to have is people who are on the ground really interacting with the people. So the king makes a ruling or makes a decision, then the people are forced to do it by these bureaucrats who come around and tell them what to do. The additional problem with what happens under Cardinal Richelieu is they ruthlessly attack the Calvinists. This, again, is an effort to root out Protestantism throughout Western Europe. If you think back to the first lecture that we talked about from this chapter, Martin Luther's ideas have been spreading and they've been radical, and the questioning of everything and the questioning of what it means to be a good Christian. Does it mean you are supposed to follow the king all the time, even if he's telling you to be a certain religion, which is Catholicism, when in your conscience you believe that God is really speaking to you through the ideas of Martin Luther and you're becoming more of a Lutheran or a Calvinist? And the Calvinists are very big on like freedom of the people to make their own choices. He actually institutes a new way of organizing the church where the local people actually have way more control over what should be happening in their church. And this is going to cause a threat to the Catholic institution of the Catholic Church. And they're going to need to have the king's power and the church's authority given to them basically by God to kind of root out the different rebellious groups, especially the ones under the Calvinists. And that's why even today there was a very large population of Calvinists. There's still a moderate-sized version of Calvinism still being practiced in France to this day. But they're really going to try and get rid of all the Calvinists who are in France at this time. Next, we get to King Louis XIV, or the Sun King, from 1643 to 1715. I'm not even going to pronounce the French, but his big famous line is, "The state, that's me." He embodies everything that is absolute monarchy and the divine right of kings. He believed that the power of governance, the power of the people, all kind of are rooted in him. And because of his kingship. He is the government, and by being the government, there is no France without him, is what he believed. That the French people are him. He is the French people. It's all intertwined. Yes, the people might not like one decision or another, but he is France. When you think of France, you think of King Louis XIV, and for him, there wasn't any question on whether he was in charge or why he was supposed to rule. He was the king, and that's the end of the argument. He does build this magnificent palace at Versailles. It's not Versailles, 1670s, and it becomes his court. Under King Louis XIV, the Palace of Versailles grows immensely. It's a beautiful building. You can Google it sometimes. It has gold everywhere. It has marble. He built himself a private opera house. He built himself a private church. He has wings to his home. One side, he has his wife and his wife's apartments. On the other side, he has himself and his apartments. And there's enough room in this entire estate that is able to house all of government. He moves the entirety of the French government to his estate, and they run from there. There's servants' quarters. There's marble horse stables that he builds. He builds giant gardens. One of the famous stories is that the water pressure for Versailles was not adequate enough to run all the fountains at one time. So when King Louis would wander through the gardens and observe his fountains, there was these people that would have to run behind the scenes and turn on the fountain really quick. And as he walked by, he would go, yes, great fountain, wonderful. And then as he walked away, they would turn off the fountain and then run ahead of him and turn on the next fountain to make sure that the king, when he walked by, saw these beautiful fountains magnificently pumping out water and just showed his power. It gets kind of ludicrous at one point where there's a whole ordeal and a whole ceremony just to the king even waking up, and many of the nobles have been relegated to positions of serving him. Some of them even fought over who could help him dress in the morning because they knew that the power of the government it emanated from the king, and by being able to even just help the king, you're seen as valuable, and maybe your ideas or your policies or whatever you're trying to get done for yourself can really be accessed by the king because you're able to be there, and as you're helping him put on his morning robe or his coat, you can start to talk to him a little bit about some of the issues that you're having in your life. It was the largest building in Europe at the time, 1,400 fountains, 25,000 fully grown trees were transplanted. They were literally dug up out of the ground and then replanted at Versailles so that he could have a magnificent garden set up, and the power was centered in the court, and it was important. Nobles were pressured to maintain presence. So even if you didn't really see the king as being useful to what you wanted to do, it was really seen as if you weren't there, you were not in the loop. You were not part of the gang. You were not part of the group. And you didn't really matter if you weren't around the Sun King. Here's a picture of King Louis XIV. He's dressed in his royal vestiges. He's got fancy shoes. He's got a very elaborate coat. He's got his scepter, his sword. Everything about him just screams power and prominence and importance, and you can see that just in this picture alone. Next, we get absolutism in Russia. The Romanov Dynasty from 1613 to 1917. We have Peter the First, or Peter the Great, who ruled from 1682 to 1725. Originally, in his younger years, he traveled throughout Europe under a false name. Now, the funniest story is that, yes, he traveled through Europe, and you think about this like prince and pauper kind of situation where, oh, they didn't even know that the king was at the pub or down the road. When in reality, most sources kind of show that he traveled with a very extensive and large entourage, and while you might have not really noticed him, you probably would have noticed that guy who wandered into the bar with about 20-something other people just watching him and making sure he's safe. So you'd understand this man is important even if he didn't dress the way he ought to. He becomes Tsar at 24, a very young man. But he tries very hard to modernize Russia on the Western European model. By wandering around Europe, he saw that Russia was very far behind technologically in the way that it interacted with its world. They were still practicing feudalism in a large part of Russia, and he wanted to bring the armies and a lot of the different military parts of Russia up to speed with the rest of Europe. So he developed the modern Russian army. He reformed the Russian government bureaucracy and changing how that worked, and he demanded changes in fashion, and he actually forbid beards. Now, most people today, when they think of a beard, they think of a hipster, and that's kind of a thing of being cool and trendy. But at the same time, in Europe at this time, there wasn't really this sense that beards were seen as progressive. They were seen as like a holdover from the old days. It goes back to like the bearded religious man, or the bearded yogi, as we've seen in India, or the bearded rabbi in Judea and Jerusalem area. And so he forbids beards, and it's a big part of Russian culture that gets changed and switched around as a result of this. He builds a new capital at St. Petersburg. No, it is not named after him. It is named after St. Peter, one of the apostles that Jesus had. But it's just so nice to always have that kind of similar name that you can name your giant capital city after. Yeah. Catherine II, or Catherine the Great, ruled from 1762 to 1796. She was known as an Enlightenment ruler. She tried in a lot of ways to apply some of these Enlightenment ideals. We're going to talk about this in a couple minutes, of progressing society, of using reason, of using logic to get across information and ideas about how to rule or how to live your life, or how you should view science or religion. And she pushed a huge military expansion. She partitions Poland, or breaks off parts of Poland for herself between 1772 and 1797. She has very big social reforms at first, but they end with the Puchigiev peasant rebellion in 1773, between 1774 in there. So it works out well, but a lot of her reforms aren't seen as being very good for all the people, so there is a little bit of a rebellion there. Next, we get the European state system. There's no imperial authority to mediate regional disputes. Back in the day, when we talked about like the Holy Roman Empire and Byzantium and a lot of the larger European institutions, there was a final word and authority in who was in charge. The problem is this shifts away from that system as Europe starts to kind of break off into different sections. And as we saw with King Louis, he sees France as his, and his section, he gets to be the absolute and divine ruler of that section. He doesn't need to listen to the cardinals. He doesn't need to listen to the Pope. He just feels like he is everything that is France, and there is no need to really consult God, because God put him in charge, and whatever he decides is good and valuable. And this starts to cause problems, because who owns what action should be taken, what taxes should be levied, what's going on in Europe in general. And we end up with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. After the 30 Years' War, all these Europeans are fighting one another, and they lead to Peace of Westphalia, which is that they have the right and the power to govern their area with absolute authority. European states to be recognized as sovereign and equal. The idea of national self-determination, that whatever your ruler or monarch or your people decide, that's how it's going to work. That is what the government's going to go by. If you want to have one king and he's the absolute monarch, then that's fine for your section, but not in my section. If another country wants to have a king mixed with a parliament system, that's great too, but not in my system. Everyone just kind of decides to do their own thing based on their own region of influence. There were religious and other domestic affairs that were protected. The idea was very heavily influenced as well by religion. Germany, very big on Lutheranism. They see themselves as being almost opposed or opposite to that of the Catholic monarchs and the Catholic religion. So a lot of the religious traditions of having protection for different versions of Protestantism are respected under different kings, and especially within regional sections. If your king, for example, was a Catholic, most likely a large population of your country would be Catholic as well. Same thing with the Calvinists, same thing with the Lutherans, same thing with the Anabaptists, or whatever group you want to kind of look at in terms of Christianity. Warfare continues. There's opposition to French expansion. This is where we get back to the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. Again, this is fighting over who should be in charge of what. It also goes back to colonialism and what's going on with the colonies overseas and in Africa in general, and some in Southeast Asia. Who is in charge? Why are they there? Do they even have a claim? And usually it came down to whoever had the most guns, the most armies. Those are the ones who were going to win out in the end. The balance of power between these kings was very tenuous at best. That who was more in charge, who was less in charge, it's not super clear all the time. And many times the people didn't necessarily listen to one king over another, even if the king said that they were in charge of that section. Yes, monarchy was upheld. Yes, at the end of the day, the peasants or the people of the section would pretty much follow one person or another, but that balance of who was really powerful at this time wasn't super clear. Innovations in military technology proceed rapidly. We get gunpowder from China, which leads to guns, which leads to larger guns known as cannons, which leads to artillery. And by artillery, I mean just bigger cannons. You can see the idea that they're using war and warfare and violence to kind of progress their science, their technology, all in the efforts of keeping their power, keeping their hegemony over sections, and keeping people kind of in place through this system of power. Here's Europe after the Peace of Westphalia. You can see the Holy Roman Empire outlined in purple of what it used to be, but now it's kind of broken up into Bohemia, Austria, the German states in general, and then you see the Spanish Habsburg possessions, the Austrian Habsburg possessions in green. Everyone's kind of deciding for themselves who should own what, why it should be owned that way, and they're really starting to fight one another over this process. Population growth and urbanization. Rapidly growing population due to the Columbian Exchange. We talked about calorie counts increasing as a result of the Columbian Exchange. Surplus of goods, surplus of new types of calories, and this improves nutrition. The role of the potato. It was originally considered an aphrodisiac in the 16th and 17th centuries, back to the idea that if you ate a potato, your lover would fall madly in love with you, or you could convince someone through eating a potato that it was in their best benefit to be with you. It replaces bread as a staple of diet. Bread takes a long time to grow. It has to be protected from the elements. It's made from wheat, and then it has to be processed into flour, and then that flour has to be added with water and some other stuff to make bread, and then that bread has to be baked. It takes a long time to make it, whereas potatoes, you can pretty much pull them straight out of the ground. You can chop off some of the leaves and then heat it up, and you got a good potato. It's also very high in calories. It can last longer compared to bread. Bread gets moldy very quickly without preservatives, whereas potatoes, if you process them right, as the Native Americans had done before the Columbian Exchange, you can actually keep potatoes around for a very long time. Better nutrition reduces the susceptibility to the plague. The plague is on the downward trend as a result of this. People are learning to basically eat and introduce new types of vitamins, minerals through this diversity of food to their diet. This increases their survivalhood of the plague. And when you're, in general, your body is doing better because it's healthy, you're able to resist germs. Many of us don't get sick very often because we have a very high level of resistance because of our immune system. But when we have a very weak immune system, we haven't been sleeping, we don't have a good diet, we have some other issues, then we're more susceptible to the plague itself or other diseases. And as a result of nutrition, people get healthier. Epidemic diseases become insignificant for overall population decline by mid-17th century. By this point, because of the nutrition, because of the different ways that people are able to support their immune system, not, for example, with emergency, that stuff you take right before you get sick, people are basically able to outlive and use their natural immunity to diseases as a result of this. Here's a chart showing by 1500, the plague had kind of taken a large chunk of Europe away, but by 1800, we're almost to the 180 million population in Europe. Urbanization. Look at these cities. You can see that, for example, that looks like Paris in 1550, around 125,000 people, and we have London closer to, what is that, probably 50,000, 100,000, somewhere in there. 1600, London non-existent in this way, and then we have the rise of Madrid around 1600. But if you look at how urbanization, or the coming together of people into large cities, creates a better way of interacting with their environment. Think about if you lived in the country. You would have access to food because of farming, but you wouldn't have access to, for example, education, hospitals, transportation in a very readily available way. But urbanization collectivizes or concentrates a lot of the needs and goods of people into one location, and you're able to pretty much go down to a store, for example, and buy some bread, and then go next door and you can get some health care from some weird doctor that's probably there. And this improves the rate of life and grows people as time goes on. Next, we get to early capitalism. Private parties offer goods and services on a free market. This is one of those weird economic theories we have to kind of slow down and talk about. Private parties are offering goods and service on a free market. So when you think about how people buy things or sell things, in a free market, people are free to buy or sell whatever they find that people will buy. So for example, I really like Coke Zero. In a free market system, I can go down and buy Coke Zero from the store down the road, and I can drink it. And yes, we know that soda is probably not the best thing to be putting in your body, but in a free market, I have the option to buy with my money whatever I want. And if I choose instead to buy an apple instead of drinking Coke Zero, then that's my right as a human being. But this also includes the idea that private parties are doing this process. Private individuals that are not owned by the government, that are not run by the government. This is kind of the difference between, for example, the post office, which is a government-run institution in the United States, and the UPS, the United Parcel Service or Postal Service, Parcel Service, which is the brown trucks that deliver goods and packages. Both facilitate the same things. They both deliver goods across a mail system, but one is publicly owned in terms of the government owns it, which is the United States Postal Service, and one is privately owned by an individual company that has shareholders and people who own a stake in that company. That's a private party. Now, goods are anything that can be bought or sold and consumed, like apples, shoes, hard drives. You get the whole idea. And services, on the other hand, are like when you get your nails done, or when you get your hair did, or when someone is willing to wash your dog. That's a service, something that isn't tangible, but it needs to be done. In early capitalism, these private parties or individuals own the means of production. They own their own labor. When you work, there are only a few things that can happen. You can either work for yourself, and you are paid as a result of the work you do. If you owned your own liquor store down the road, right, and you sold candy and chips and stuff to kids at Cerritos, you get to own all the successes and failure of that process. So if we're talking about you being a good liquor store, you sell tons of candy, soda, chips, and stuff like that, whereas you get to, as a result of that, you will get all the benefits from that. You get to make lots of money. On the other hand, you also get to own all the failures of a business. If you open that same store and you are not successful in selling candy or soda or chips, then you're going to end up losing money and maybe even losing a ton of money, which will result in you having to close the business. You own the means of production. You own your product that you make, whether it's selling something. For example, if you were a carpenter and you made wood things like chairs and tables, you would own your labor. It's not a result of the government. This is different, however, from the societies we're going to look at later on that enforce capitalism or larger extent socialism. When you do labor, it is actually the product of all the people. So in communism, in the USSR, for example, when somebody would make a tractor and somebody worked at a tractor factory, they got paid the same rate as everyone else because the government owned all the tractors. You made tractors for the government, and then the government decided who should get the tractors. You, in that instance of communism, do not own your means of production. It also relies on private initiative, not government control. If you think that the best thing to do to open up across the street from the school would be a place that sold cheeseburgers and hot dogs and french fries, then that is your initiative or your desire to do that, and it's not forced by the government saying what we need here is this thing. If you think about different government services like the DMV, they place DMVs in strategic locations so that people have access to it in a larger area. We don't have DMVs just popping up randomly owned by private people because that's not a good that the private industry can create, but it's also regulated by the government to increase efficiency. It doesn't always work that way, but that's the hope. Supply and demand determines prices. If you have a high supply of something, for example, shoes at a shoe store, and you want to sell them very quickly, you lower your prices so that you can sell them very quickly. If you have a low supply of something, you are then able to raise your prices to a certain point so that people will pay you a lot of money for very little amounts of goods. I use the shoe example because, for example, you could go to the store, you could go to Payless and buy a normal pair of shoes that are very cheap for $20, $30. But many people do not want to do that. They'd rather buy Nikes. And Nike, because of their brand, because of their limited quantity on some models, have decided to raise the prices and lower the actual stock. So I went to the store the other day and I saw these really fancy Nikes. They were like $200. And I know that there's a very limited supply of those Nikes. If you want those Nikes, you need to buy them now or buy them later from somebody who had already bought them, but they're not going to make any more of those. So that's a low supply. And then the price raises. So supply and demand determines prices. In the example I used before with the USSR and communism, the government would determine the prices. For example, in the USSR again, the government determined the price of bread. Bread was not something that I could say, well, it costs me $3 to make for bread. I'm going to add $1 for my labor, and I'll sell bread for $4. And my neighbor down the road, he wants to sell bread too, but he can't do it as efficiently as I can. So he sells bread for $6 while people will come to me. That's not how it would work in a more regulated economy that isn't capitalistic. They would determine the prices and say everyone who makes bread must sell it for $4. That's a regulated or very overseen type of economy that is in opposite of capitalism. Next, we have banks and stock exchanges develop in early modern period. Banks are great places to get loans, to store your money, to get more capital, which is money for your business. So if you, for example, are very good at selling those chips back at that liquor store example, then you want to expand and buy more chips, or you want to build a bigger store so that more people can have more selection, you can take a loan from a bank and they will lend you the money on interest, making them money and making you money in the process. Stock exchanges are a way to buy a stake or a share in the companies that you like. For example, Apple sells stocks. When you buy a stock of Apple, you technically own whatever percentage of that stock. So if you own one stock in Apple, if there's 1 million stocks of Apple, you are 1/1,000,000th of an owner of Apple. So you get to get money as a result of that, because as the business does well, your value of that specific stock goes up and you could sell that for more money. So it's in your best interest to buy the stock and hope that the company does well, so that way you can reap the rewards of owning that part of a company. It also gives the companies money because initial stock that is sold by the company, and they get to collect the money from that initial sale. And over time, they also collect small percentages as the stock is sold and bought and traded. Joint stock companies like the VOC we've talked about, these are people who have come together, and you can collect your money. You don't need a ton of money, but you can collect your money into one stock, and you can then get goods from this process, and then you can make money because they are making money. It is very much in relationship with empire building. We talked in the chapter before about how the empire was growing the empires of Europe were growing as a result of them making money. The government's best interest was to protect the people and the individual stock and shareholders for their process of making money and going out and collecting goods through colonialism, and people were able to reap the rewards as a result of that. Medieval guilds are discarded in favor of the putting out system. The guilds we talked about before secretly and selectively choose their membership, and then they decide who can do the practice of, for example, blacksmithing, and who can't be a blacksmith, and it's very regulated, like a union is today. The putting out system changes that because it moves to something that we would know today as subcontracting, which is there is a contract for work to be done, and a factory or a company or a group hire individuals to make those goods. This is known as the putting out system, where people work from home. This is a very big step in terms of women's history, because the putting out system allowed women to work from home during their times when they weren't doing other domestic duties to create goods that could then earn them money and increase their spendable cash in general. So that was early capitalism. Very lot to take in. The impact of capitalism on the social order. In the rural life, in the areas outside of the city, there was improved access to manufactured goods. Many people, as a result of the putting out system and just the proliferation and the growth of manufactured goods in general, people were able to get access to more goods that they didn't have to make themselves. Think about shoes. If you and I were to try and make shoes, we would be very, very bad at this process. But if there is a factory that makes shoes and there's an increase in capitalism, which results in an increase of people wanting to efficiently make shoes that are going to sell to make them money, they're going to make shoes in the best way they can, in the most efficient way they can, which means that they're going to make a ton of shoes, which means that people can then buy those shoes, and it will be more uniform, and it improves the access for people in rural areas to goods. There's also increasing opportunities in urban centers, begins the depletion of the rural population. This is the start of the big shift from the countryside, where many people lived in individual villages or under the feudalistic systems that we talked about before, and they shift to the cities where they can now have a job working in a factory or working in some sort of way to support the overall cosmopolitan area. So a baker, for example. In the olden days, if you lived rurally, you made your own bread, and then you baked it, and then you ate it. Now, you move to the city, you know how to bake bread, you work in a bakery, and people pay you for your bread. It is an inefficient institution of the serfdom is abandoned in Western Europe and retained in Russia until the 19th century. This goes back to Peter the Great, where he's trying to work out how to get rid of so many of these peasants and make them more urban. It doesn't even work until the 19th century, but this idea of feudalism and serfdom goes away during this time as a result of capitalism. Nuclear families, or the immediate family, the father, mother, brother, sister, are replaced with extended families. Now you live or interact more with cousins, and you're able to meet your aunts and uncles and your grandparents, which are maybe nearby now because of the city and the urban population. Gender changes as women enter income-earning workforce. Before, women were seen as stuck in the home. They were seen as not very valuable as men. They just took care of domestic duties, whereas women are able to actually work in factories and are able to earn paychecks for themselves, making themselves more independent. We're going to talk about this way more a little bit later. Capitalism and morality. As a result of capitalism, people start to think about how should the world be organized and operate as a result of this new way of looking at economics. The first guy we're going to talk about is Adam Smith, from 1723 to 1790, argued that capitalism would ultimately improve society as a whole. I would argue the exact same. That capitalism has done a great job at improving the lives of people in general. He had this big idea called the invisible hand, that the market or the stock market or what people want in general as a society is an invisible hand that moves across a society. We can't really tell why people want what they want, but the way that people react and try and find a new way into that system is what makes capitalism awesome. So think about it like when I was growing up, there was no such thing as Facebook or Twitter or smartphones. And if you were to ask somebody back when I was growing up, what's like the next big thing, nobody could really tell you. They might have had an idea, but they couldn't really say for certain. And the invisible hand has moved through our markets, so now you could actually get a job writing apps. You could make hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, maybe even millions, just writing apps for smartphones. A job that was completely unheard of 20 years ago. There's major social change, but major social change increases poverty in some sectors. Because of this shift and change, not everyone is going to be benefiting as a result of this. People that originally could just live on a farm, that could grow and live their lives in peace in a rural way, now have to move to cities. There's a lot more competition for jobs. Not everyone can be employed through this process. There's a rise in crime because now people are closer together. They're more desperate. They're in need of finding jobs. They can't find a job, so they're willing to steal, hurt, do other types of very bad, poor behavior, and this changes the way that we interact as a whole. And then witch hunting is a possible consequence of capitalist tensions and gender roles. In the New England area, specifically Salem, Massachusetts, there was this issue of women being burned at the stake for being witches or drowned for being witches. Witch hunting is possible a consequence of capitalist tensions because As men are competing for jobs and men are looking to find for themselves employment, women oftentimes were seen as very beneficial to the process because many factory owners still played into the old system that women were less valuable than men and were able to pay them less for the same amount of work. So factory owners would rather employ 100 women that they could pay at half the cost of employing 100 men at paying full price. And since this tension was happening, many times there was a way to try and find an excuse for why women were being so successful. Some religious fanatics and some people at the time argued that women used their feminine charm with assistance from the devil himself and created a way for women to be successful when in the past they weren't successful. So now they must be doing witchcraft, which is causing them to be successful. So this tension between how men are making money, between what women are supposed to be doing, and this newly found independence is also a part of seeing that women are not following the old traditional roles, and that because women want all this freedom and all this change, they must be influenced by Satan because he's giving them all these wild ideas that they should just leave their homes and start their new lives and make their own money and not get married. And so this caused a lot of tension between the genders. Next, we're going to move on to the scientific revolution, the Copernican universe. It's a reconception of the universe. Originally, people believed that the universe started with Earth being at the center of all of the universe and everything we could see. God had made humans. He had made the Earth in 6 days, and he had put us in the very center of his focus, and that is why when we look out into the stars and we look at the planets around us, we know those are obviously just there for us, and that as a result, we are kind of the middle of everything, and there's nothing else that is important except for us, and God focuses on us, and isn't that awesome? Copernicus relied on 2nd century Greek scholar Claudius Ptolemy of Alexandria, who then argued that no, because you can pretty much get the same observational data when you look at the sky as if the sun was at the center of the universe and we were just one of the planets rotating around it. This does challenge religion because many people say if God is the powerful supreme being of all and we are his most precious creation, according to Christianity and Judaism, then obviously God cares about us so much he put us in the center. When you replace us at the center with the sun, then what you're saying is that we aren't as important as we thought. And so this is going to cause conflict between religion and science. The first time in history, pretty much. Motionless Earth inside 9 concentric spheres. They move to this idea, away from this idea that the Earth doesn't move, it just sits there, and there's 9 spheres that move around it. Christians understand heaven as the last sphere, so if you just went outside of what we now know as the solar system, you'll just end up with God in heaven. They had difficulty reconciling the model with observed planetary movement. In 1543, Nicholas Copernicus of Poland breaks this theory. And he's going to say what I said before, which is that the sun is at the center, the Earth moves around it, and it's just one of many planets moving around it. The notion of moving Earth challenges Christian doctrine. We talked about this a little bit a couple minutes ago. Here's a picture representation of the views of the universe. So under Ptolemy, the Earth was at the center with the moon circling around it. Mercury, Venus, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. Under Copernicus, his new thing is that there's the sun at the center, then the Mercury, Venus, Earth, the moon, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and they had no idea about the farther out planets, which Pluto is one, and distant motionless stars outside of that. Next, we get to the scientific revolution with Johannes Kepler, with Galileo Galilei. They reinforce the Copernican model. Sir Isaac Newton, he revolutionizes the study of physics. And there's a rigorous challenge to church doctrines. Using reason, using logic, using observable, understandable data, people were actually challenging what the church was teaching about what is natural, what is science, what is, for example, the meaning of life. If we're not the center of the universe as a result of Copernicus, maybe God didn't create everything. And if God didn't create everything, now what? How are we supposed to live our lives? One of the best things I can recommend to you is watch one of my favorite series, known as Cosmos by Neil deGrasse Tyson. It's on YouTube, it's on TV all the time. It goes into the lives of these men very intimately, intricately, and it gives you all the background and understanding about this scientific revolution and why science has radically changed the way we understand our world even today. Next, we have Women in Science. William Harvey scientifically proves the innate female inferiority. So this man named William Harvey uses science, quote unquote, to prove that females are inferior. He looks at things like muscle mass, that since women have less muscle mass and men have more muscle mass, they are able to do more labor, which in turn proves that women are less than men. But then we get this lady named Emile de Chalet. From 1701 to 1749. She was a French mathematician and physicist. She translated Newton's Principia Mathematica. So she's a brilliant mind sitting on the shoulders of a woman, and she is pretty awesome in the history of our world. She proved that women are just as equally capable as men by being able to even just translate Newton's work. She showed her value to society. She was a physicist, she was a mathematician, she was able to compete with some of the men in terms of knowledge and publishing and writing, and she's seen as one of the first women of the Enlightenment, and really counteracting some of those claims by people like William Harvey, who said that women were inferior because of muscle mass, and also at this time they believed women had smaller brains than men, and they were just incapable of learning things at the level that men were able to learn them at. Kind of BS, even to this day. Next, we have the Enlightenment. We've been bouncing around it, but now we're going to talk about it. It is a trend away from Aristotelian philosophy and church doctrine in favor of rational thought and scientific analysis. Aristotle and the church are very big on faith, and I want you to keep this kind of clear. Faith as a belief in something, even if you can't prove it, it's just the way it is. So a belief in God. You can't prove God, but God exists, and you just have to have faith that he exists and he does all the things. The Enlightenment was a move away from faith to logic and reason. That is not to say that there isn't logic and reason in religion, it's just to say that it wasn't the point of focus for many of the religious thinkers of this time. And many of the Enlightenment thinkers argued that rational thought and scientific analysis was the best way to understand our world. Don't believe something just because somebody told you what's what. You should test it out, prove it, use the scientific method, as many of you have used in science classes before. Why does something happen? How come something does what it does? What's the point of something happening? For example, observing the stars. There's a man named John Locke in England, Montesquieu. They attempt to discover natural laws of politics. They argue that if God is kind of a passé or kind of gone away. Let's look at the world and how we should organize ourselves if God didn't exist. In the past, everybody just kind of lived the way they ought to live because they feared that when they died, God would punish them. But Locke and Montesquieu argue that if God doesn't exist, then that means there would be anarchy. But we need to prevent anarchy because that's not good for society. So how should you rationally and using your logic, using your brain, figure out how you should live your life? And they argue that there is a natural law. There's a law that promotes the most peace, the most benefit to the most people. The center of enlightenment is in France, where the philosophies are going to salons, not like hair salons, but like dinner parties where they're showing off new ideas, talking about the latest in philosophy. Think about a really cool like convention as like teachers go to or professors go to, and they talk about the newest, greatest, and latest ideas. One of these philosophies is known as Voltaire. He sends out caustic attacks on the Roman Catholic Church, and he says this famous thing in French, which I'm not going to say, but crush the damn thing. He believed that the church was the biggest hindrance to people's progress and people's benefits because it forced them to rely on faith rather than logic and reason. So Voltaire wrote this just tons of works about how people need to live their lives free from faith, free from superstition, free from religion, and that using your logic and reason is the best way to make sense of your life and the world as a whole. Another thing that pops up is deism, the belief that some God exists, but he probably doesn't care about us. He probably just made us on a whim, or maybe he did make us and maybe he's watching, but he's not really doing anything. And God isn't a part of our everyday lives. For Christians, and Catholics especially, God did everything. God literally got up every morning, just like how you get up every morning, and he made the sun rise. He had to do that, and then he had to make the earth do what it do, and he had to make all the animals and trees be born, and he had to make the wind move, and as a result, God was a very integral and intimate part of our lives, and we can maybe make him do things by praying to him. So, God, my grandma is dying. Could I pray to you to maybe not make her die or to heal her? And maybe God would listen. Deism, on the other hand, believes that God maybe is away and maybe he doesn't care. Or maybe he's just not paying attention. Or maybe God made us and he's just done. Just like how you have a toy that you haven't played with and maybe since you were a little kid, that's kind of what God sees us as. And that starts to become increasingly popular because they argue that if God exists and God is all good, how come all these bad things keep happening? Well, maybe God is just not paying attention, or maybe God is asleep, or maybe he's just not there. And so deism shows a rise because it's kind of a result of looking at the world and arguing if God is good, logically, then he should fix things. But since he doesn't things, logically, God must not be paying attention or he might not even exist. Next, I want to kind of have you watch this video, add it to your notes, info from Crash Course. It's http://bit.ly Toyama-cc-chapter 23. This is John Green talking about the American Revolution, the Enlightenment. I'd focus really heavily on the, near the end when he starts talking about the Enlightenment and its influence on our culture. I'll let you go ahead and open up a new tab, watch that, and then come on back. All right, so welcome back. We're going to continue on the theory of progress. There was an assumption that Enlightenment thought would ultimately lead to human harmony and material wealth. Everyone in the Christian circles at this time believed that there was a degradation, that when God made the world and he made the Garden of Eden, it was perfect, it was good. And then sin entered the world, and as a result, things have just been going downhill ever since, and they're never going to get better ever again. There's only just going to be this degradation until Judgment Day when Jesus comes back and fixes everything and starts all over. The Enlightenment, however, believed that we could use logic and reason and science to make our world better and to prevent war and to make people healthier and to not let people die from dumb things. And that in addition to making things better, that people could actually get wealthier as a result of using their brains and their logic. There's a decline in the authority of traditional organized religion. I'll stop here and let you think about that. Why? Why would that maybe happen? If you said that the church argued that you need God to make anything good, then you're right. Here's why. Many of the Enlightenment thinkers increasingly were becoming deists, and some even were moving to atheism where they believed there was no God. In Christianity, you have to have God to do anything good because you are naturally bad because you have sin. God makes good things, and your good things that you make are only a result of God giving you a blessing to do that good thing. Under the Enlightenment thinkers, they argued if you look around at all the good, if you look at all the positives, at all the beneficial things, and if God doesn't exist, then we don't need God to make good things. And so therefore, we don't have to listen to religion because if they're wrong about this, and they're wrong about science, and they're wrong about the planets, and they're wrong about philosophy, and they're wrong about government, and they're wrong about everything, why should we listen to them anymore? So that's kind of the answer there. We made it! When you have finished studying this chapter, you should be able to do the following. Explain the origins and development of the Protestant Reformation. This goes back to the first lecture from part 1. Identify and discuss key features of the Catholic Reformation or the Counter-Reformation. Number 3, understand and explain the relationship between the Reformation, witch hunts, and religious wars. How come all that is intertwined? Number 4, discuss the attempted revival of empire in early modern Europe. How is this very different, and how is it shifting away from the classical Byzantium, Roman models to this new model involving boats and the Columbian Exchange? So kind of look at that a little. Next, compare and contrast the new monarchies of Spain, France, and England, and the constitutional states in England and Holland. I draw a little chart, label 5 little boxes, list them all out. Compare and contrast absolute monarchies in France and Russia. How was France different from that of Russia? Look at King Louis XIV, and then look at Peter the Great. How were they different? How are they the same? What was going on in Russia at the time? What was going on in France at the time? How did people organize themselves around those individuals and around the government as a whole? Next, explain the rise of the European state system. There's a whole slide on it. Go back. Make sure you know that very well. Next, identify and discuss key features of early modern European capitalist society and proto-industrialization. That was a very large section. I don't expect you to get all of it right now, but just start to wrap your mind around it. We're going to go over capitalism and industrialization a lot in the coming chapters. Next, discuss the course and features of social change in modern Europe. Why did society shift? What big ideas were happening? There were two big, giant movements that we talked about, and they both kind of are intertwined, and they both relied on two big words. So I want you to go back, make sure you know why and what's going on in Europe. And finally, explain the cause and course of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. There are two words. What is driving the scientific revolution? What is driving the Enlightenment? Who are the big people? What are their big ideas? Why does this matter to our understanding of world history at this time? And how did it shift people's even thinking then? Next up is your writing assignment. Write a short response, 5 to 8 sentences, to the following questions, using specific examples from the textbook, and be prepared to discuss them in class. Number 1, to what extent did Martin Luther create a Protestant Reformation? Or was he simply the right man at the right time? Number 2, how does the Enlightenment alter perceptions toward the natural world, and how does it do it towards religion? Think about how the Enlightenment changed the way that people looked at the world, and the universe in general, and then think about how does the Enlightenment alter the way that people looked at religion. Did it change? It most definitely did. And why? As always, it's been great. I want to thank you for listening along to part 2 of chapter 23. It's time to reread your chapter. Make sure you're ready for our test coming up, and I will see you again next time. Bye.
What we do here is go back.